The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and/or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off. To learn more about Daemoneye Publishing and download free products, visit our website at daemoneye.net. That's DAEMONEYE.net. Hey there, internets. Welcome to the Daemoneye Podcast, Episode 2, entitled Fear and Horror in Gaming, as is appropriate given the time of year. I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm Jay Burrell.
And we're here at the Daemoneye Podcast, the podcast where we discuss electronic and tabletop gaming, science, technology, geek culture, sci-fi fantasy fiction, and nonviolent ways of driving missionaries from one's home in a manner that still causes the maximum discomfort for them. My favorite way... Go ahead.
You forgot sex toys. Oh, wait a minute. We already covered that under Driving Away Missionaries.
Yeah, my favorite method, it involves pretending I'm possessed by Cthulhu or trying to convert them to demonology. That's always worth a laugh.
My favorite method involves a small puzzle box.
Okay, and does it involve releasing Cenobites from beyond the grave to wreak unspeakable horror on them?
How'd you guess?
That's kind of a violent method, isn't it?
Well, they end up enjoying it.
I'm not going to argue the point anymore. Let's go ahead and talk about our topic for this podcast is, as the moniker implies, fear and horror in gaming. That is, how to apply aspects of fear, horror, and terror in games, both electronic and even tabletop. But first of all, let's take a minute to discuss fall and October, my favorite times of year and my favorite month, respectively. I love the fact that it's a transitionary time. It's not too hot, not too cold. It's also harvest time, so there's plenty of red and yellow foliage. Love that. It's also one of the most obviously and blatantly secularized holiday, and it's one of the few holidays that the Catholic Church really is actually kind of uncomfortable about trying to bring into its fold. I mean, yeah, they have All Saints' Day, but this is the one holiday where it's really just about costumes and candy, and no one gives a shit about the church's version of All Hallows' Day. What about you, Tyler?
I know the source of it, I know the history, and I know about the whole All Saints' Day thing, BS. And to be honest, I much prefer the let's just scare the piss out of people with scary costumes version, particularly given all the candy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a celebration of the weird, the uncanny, and the macabre. How can you not love that? Let's go ahead and get right to it. So first, let's start with use of fear in electronic games. So we're talking, of course, like PlayStation games, the PC. There's been something of a renaissance in horror in indie gaming lately. There are obvious examples, the Slenderman series, but there have been a whole bunch of clones and knockoffs, and even some original pieces of work, and even some might say AAA quality games coming out of so-called indie developers. The great example would be the Outlast series. So one of the things I want to address here is one of the fundamental problems of conveying a sense of fear, horror, terror, or dread into games is that the player really isn't in any danger. I mean, they're just sitting there with their little electronic doodads, and how you actually instill that sense of fear, dread, and terror when they're not in any real danger. How do you go about doing that?
Well, there's a fundamental disconnect in a lot of people's understanding of horror. See, there's the trappings of horror, and then there's the actual this makes you shit your pants scary. Classically, the trappings of horror have been things like demons and other types of monsters and bizarre curses and stuff like that. But so many games confuse the two and think that if you just toss in the trappings, the horror will follow. But the reason those things were scary to begin with is because they instilled a sense of fear via helplessness and the mystery of the unknown. However, if it has game statistics and most importantly hit points You're no longer helpless, nor do you have the mystery of the unknown.
I mean, yeah, the classic example, of course, is the Silent Hill series. The best one, which many people say is the second one. There is no in-screen hit points value. There's no real icons. It's just basically a video shot of the character, and there's not even any hit points or even. There's kind of a picture that shows your general state in the inventory screen, but that's about it. And it's special, and Silent Hill is derived from Japanese sensibilities in horror and fear, which in many ways are superior to some Western ideas. Jump scares, monster jumps out of the window suddenly versus that weird creeping fear, which you alluded to. The problem with jump scares is that it gets old after a while. But at the same time, you have to have, at some point, there has to be some sort of danger come in, with that slow creeping sense. So it's kind of find a balance between the two of them.
Which is something that can be very difficult to do in a game system and game setting because like we said before in the previous podcast, you have to have player agency. The player has to be able to manipulate and at least to some extent control the environment they're in.
Yeah, that's the thing. Dead Space. Now, let me say one thing about Dead Space. Dead Space, I like Dead Space, especially the Dead Space 1 and 2, because, yes, you are a space engineer with freaking nail guns, which can shoot straight through steel, and you also have all those weapons. But what it does for a while create this sense of dread or this sense of lack of control. And although there are kind of on-screen GUIs, it's kind of projected through an in-game way. There's like an ammo counter, but it's presented as a holographic counter that the weapon projects, and the hit points are represented by a little bar that's actually attached to the character's back, where if it turns red, you're going bad. So it's kind of like an in-game hit point counter, but not really. And one thing that Dead Space 1 did that all the other ones don't is instilling that sense of dread. There are instances where the monsters jump up and go, as they're running towards you, but there's also this creeping sense of dread and forlornness and being alone that Dead Space, I think, 1 does very well. Dead Space 2 kind of does it too, but Dead Space 3 was basically just a horror game with...
Dead Space 3 was a run and gun with horror monsters.
It's basically just a third-person shooter which got kind of gory. That's it. There is kind of a bit of a blurred line. When do you say a game is a horror game and when do you say it's not? There has to be a certain degree of loss of control, vulnerability, and there also has to be kind of...
the unknown.
The unknown. That's a critical thing. You can have a scary game without any blood, guts, or gore, and so forth. If you can just create kind of this weird, disquieting sensibility in the game. What would be a good example of that? I guess Slender could be argued that Slenderman is an example of that. There's not really any blood or guts, just kind of this weird, creeping thing that inevitably gets to you. It's just kind of disquieting, this faceless, tall guy with tentacles coming out of him.
A good game as far as the unknown goes is oddly enough the Left 4 Dead series because of the randomization of monster spawns. You know where some monsters are going to be, and you even know to an extent what they're going to be. You can even predict that, oh, look, it's an apartment building, it's going to be filled with monsters. But you can never predict exactly what is going to spawn where. So no matter how many times you play through it, you're always in fear of going through that next door.
That's true, but there's also that idea that you have guns. You have another critical problem with that. I would have is that you're not alone. If you add multiple players to a horror game, I think that makes it very difficult to make an effective horror game. The best way of conveying that sense of fear and terror in a game is you have to actually be alone. If you have a teammate or someone, or even someone in the same room, or someone, even a virtual avatar in the game, that takes a big chunk of that sense of aloneness. That's one of the best ways of doing it when you're not in any real dangers. It's that whole 5 a.m. at night, you're alone, the lights are off, you're by yourself in the game. There's no real threat to you through the game, but maybe because, there's that weird sense you get, that illogical idea that, even though this is a game, there's no one else around here if something bizarrely goes wrong.
Yeah, it was the sense of the unknown that H.P. Lovecraft really excelled at.
Yeah, it was not just a sense of unknown, but also just alien weirdness. The idea that all our sensibilities about life, the universe, everything we know is actually invalid. The world, the universe itself obeys alien geometries, and that what we think is up is actually down or sideways or outside the normal time space. I mean, that gets into one of the more effective ways of kind of conveying that sense of terror and dread in a game, an electronic game anyway, is to somehow suggest that the real world is actually not as safe as you may think. Like, it's kind of like a scary movie that suggests that there are shadow people. Like there was a movie Shadow People based on that urban myth. I mean, it was a crappy movie, but the idea was suggest that these things are real and that even after and they might even coming after you after the movie. I mean, that's an effective way of scaring the person. Taking a very familiar situation in game and then turning it on its head. I mean, that's why, in a sense, a video game about a serial killer with no supernatural elements whatsoever, where they pursue the player in the game, could be much more effective than a scary ghost game, because the former could actually happen, and then it's kind of like a after effect. It leaves you scared afterwards, but that kind of brings that same sense of fear, that adrenaline that some people horror junkies live for. So if it makes it more grounded, sometimes that can make it a more effective scary game.
Yeah, so basically, as far as elements of horror goes, so far we have helplessness, the fear of the helplessness, the unknown, and isolation as far as horrifying, as far as what it takes to actually make a good horror game.
Yeah, I would say that's true, and also bringing in that sense of real danger. I mean, because again, at the end of it, what you're fighting here is the fact that the player is not in any danger. I mean, again, jump scares are just surprising a person. It throws them off balance. I mean, I think that can be used effectively in a game, but there has to be some sort of payoff in the long run from that.
Well, that's one of the reasons that tabletop games that focus on horror actually have a bonus over electronic games that focus on horror, is because unlike the electronic game, your character in the tabletop game goes from adventure to adventure to adventure. You actually end up invested in the character, and therefore you fear for any danger the character might be in.
I would say you could get invested in horror games, too. I mean, you don't usually have I can't really think of any horror game where you actually build your character, to be fair. And that's actually a good idea. There should be more horror games where, it's where you actually can create a character and then the game kind of horrifies you based around that. That'd be an interesting concept. It'd be tricky because, honestly, a lot of the best horror games are very story-driven, and therefore it's hard to give the player that much agency without compromising the game. But that would help. But
yeah, that's where Dead Space 3 fell flat. They kept on bringing out the same character over and over again that players didn't really have any investment in. Dead Space 3 would have actually been better if it had starred somebody who was just miscellaneous researcher number 27 that you actually got to build and develop. And then the first, few hours of the game were a adventure where your player had to find out what was the buried secret at the bottom of the research station, and eventually finds out what the buried secret at the bottom of the research station is by accidentally letting it loose. Basically, make the player actually build the character he wants to play, then run through a non-horror adventure with that character to become attached to it, and at the end of it, have the reason the player's trying to fight the space deadite horde is because he or she is trying to make up for the horrible mistake that they made in unleashing it.
Well, funnily enough, there were actually some kind of side stories, prequel, sequel games, add-ons to the Dead Space series where you actually did play this side schmuck character who, of course, gets chewed up later on. That was pretty effective. But the first Dead Space game, though, remember that Isaac Clarke, beyond being given a name and a little bit of background, he's a silent protagonist throughout, aside from screaming and yelling as he's hit or killed. So that actually is a good way of letting the player project him or herself into the character. But there, of course, there's a limit there. And at the sequel, he does start talking, start displaying certain personality traits. So I'm kind of kind of split there. I mean, I'm a little sick of the silent protagonist thing, let you project yourself into the character, blah blah blah. But at the same time, I really do think the first Dead Space was probably the best of the three so far.
Definitely.
Yeah, mixed bag there. But let's go ahead and move on. We talked to death about electronic fear and horrors in electronic gaming, and that's a topic that has been brought up, not us, but a lot of people many different times. So let's move on to something that people haven't talked a lot about, which we actually touched upon a little further back there, running an effective tabletop horror game. And my question to you, Tyler, is can you really even do it? Because there's a big problem right from the start with tabletop role-playing games in Fear. You're not going to be alone. There's going to be other people there with you.
I have two prime examples on how to do it right that comes from running the Dead Stars campaign. I don't remember if you were there for the first one with the cat.
The cat. The first one I was there, I was way back in the day with Jeremiah. It was myself, Jeremiah, and you and Dragon. That was the first Dead Space game I ever played. And I think the first game I ever played with you, way, way, way back in the day.
Okay, then you probably weren't there with the cat. I terrified the entire game group when they were going to investigate a security outpost on an occupied planet that had gone dark, and they got to the security outpost, and the entire place was shut down, but everybody was dead and all mauled and torn up, and all they heard while they were investigating the place for the first 3 hours of playtime was occasionally this cat would meow. And it scared the piss out of them. They had no idea what the hell was going on. They actually ended up, because the lights were all screwed up, and they had to bring their own lights. Because of that, there were shifting shadows and whatnot, and I kept on having them make spot checks to see what was going on around them. And every now and again, when they would fail a spot check, they would unleash, gunfire, because sometimes they would pass a spot check and be attacked by notice that there was some of the people that were there had been driven homicidally insane and would attack them, fearing that they were the ones who had killed all of their friends. So every now and again, they would make spot checks and notice, okay, it's just a shifting shadow. Or they would make a spot check and then notice it's somebody hiding behind a bed about to jump out and attack us, and they'd roll for combat initiative. And then they make a spot check and fail, and the player would have to decide, okay, did I fail and there's nothing there, or did I fail and there's just shifting shadows? At which point they usually unleash with full-on ammunition. But it turns out that the cat was a biomechanical familiar of a Mha-ha-ha, which is a person who follows the axiom of any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And the Mha-ha-ha had been killing the garrison so that he could steal some resources that he needed in order to build an escape pod to get off the planet. Done so by using his cat, or by basically breaking into the station's computer system and causing a meltdown, which basically blew out all the lights and all the defenses and everything, and then sending in his cat while everybody was wondering what the hell was going on to pick people off one at a time. The cat at that point was patched into the PA system, and every now and again the cat would meow and use echolocation to determine where people were moving in order to hunt them down.
The Mha-ha-ha is a prestige class from Daemoneye Publishing's flagship product, Universal Decay Dead Stars, available now on Daemoneye.net. Buy it today.
And Amazon. Blatant commercial plug.
Okay, yeah. So that's what you just described there is a pretty effective scare. So that's one thing you can do in role-playing games when you're trying to run a horror game is the GM should always use a lot of red herrings, have your players roll dice constantly, roll dice for spot checks, for everything. I mean, that's good advice in general for systems like D20 or D&D, Have them sometimes make dice rolls that don't really matter, but raise that sense of paranoia. Some GMs actually know the character. What they do is they learn the characters like spot or listen stats and then roll it themselves. Of course, you can hear the die rolling from behind the screen or computer screen or whatever. But if you don't want to have to check the player's stats every 10 minutes and you don't want to keep track of it, you can just have them roll all the time so it throws them off. That's an effective way. Now, getting to this game, Tyler, you think that the players themselves are actually kind of terrified as much as if they were, say, playing a game alone, electronic game alone at like 5 a.m.?
No,
Were they actually scared?
Oh yeah, the players were actually scared.
The players are actually shaking a little, thrown off, shaken.
You have to realize that this wasn't the first time the players had played those characters. The characters already been through a couple of adventures that were just like, fairly stereotypical science fiction style adventures. And then they had to go and investigate this outpost that had gone dark, and they thought it was just going to be more of the same. It's either under attack and transmission signals are being jammed, or they've had a systems failure and they have to go do this fetch quest in order to get a new power core or whatever, because that's what they've done before. And then they get there, and it is completely different from what they thought it was going to be. It's that sudden jarring sensation from going between we know what's going to happen because it's what's been done before, and then everything takes a complete turn into left field, and suddenly the players are completely unprepared for what the hell's going on.
So with that in mind, do you think it's actually possible to run a sustained campaign where most of the games revolve around fear and horror?
I think it's possible to run a sustained campaign where most of the games involve horror-style elements, which not necessarily are actually scary. For instance, if I had done another adventure later on with a mad guy basically trying to terrify an area as a distraction, like that adventure was, the players from that same play group would be able to just pick up on it pretty much instantly what's going on, and suddenly it's no longer unknown. But if you're creative enough to create new types of unknown situations, then you can keep a game running. Just be sure that in between your horrific situations, you have periods of relative normalcy. And the periods have to be of varying lengths. Like you could have an entire month where nothing really horrific goes on, which has the side effect, if you've had horrific adventures before, of putting the players on edge because they don't know if the next one is going to have like some sort of brain-eating tapioca pudding or whatever.
Yeah, but you have to remember that time is a malleable thing in role-playing games. A month can be passed by saying, okay, a month passes. So I would say that your answer to my question is, can you sustain a prolonged game of horror and fear over and over again? Not really. You do have to kind of break it up, if only with a couple of games where it's more predictable. Well, not so much predictable, but not so much, every adventure is you find a derelict space station, there's something horrible on it. There has to be some games where it's just you're transporting some cargo, maybe there's some pirates, maybe some negotiation, but then it's done. You're not stalked by some hideous beast from beyond the stars every session. You have to break it up a little bit.
Speaking of derelict space stations, Julian Fries.
Julian Fries?
Remember that one?
Ooh, no, my brain has failed its saving throw.
I know you were there for that one because you're the one that shot up the spacesuit.
The spacesuit. Okay, I'm not remembering that particular session, Tyler. Maybe you could enlighten both myself and our listeners.
Okay. It was a session where the players were playing basically space salvage operators, and they got hired by a guy named Julian Fries, who was an FTL pilot, so he could transport the entire party from point A to point B, but he didn't know dick about salvage. However, he was very good at research, and he managed to discover a forgotten space station from back during the days of the Gaian Empire. And he knows nobody's gone out there to salvage it since then, because it was buried in the minute details of data logs that he had found. And everybody agreed to go and help salvage the station, thinking that they were just the worst things they might have to deal with is the occasional robotic security guard that they would have to shoot up when they power the station. So they get on the ship. They get on the ship. They go there. They get there relatively easily. The ship docks at the station. Everybody goes on board. And that's the point where they find out that Julian Fries isn't the mild-mannered FTL pilot and researcher that.
Now I remember. I think now I remember. He was one of the infected, wasn't he?
He was one of the infected, a nanotech-driven super immortal super soldier who had to replace his burned-out stem cells by literally consuming fresh stem cells from other members of the same species.
That delicious bone marrow, full of stem cells, hemopoietic blood cells. Yeah, well, I remember. And you were saying something about a space chute being shot. That was when he phased out of existence, isn't it?
That was, you guys were walking along the hull of the space station to get inside to the airlock, and you cycled the airlock, and the figure comes flying out of the airlock because of the changing air pressure, but you guys didn't know that. I had everybody roll initiative. I said that the bad guy got an initiative lower than everybody else, and everybody else, other than taking time to examine the situation, realized it's just an empty spacesuit, not what it looks like, which is like, at first glance, it was like some flopping tentacled thing. Start shooting at it.
Yeah, and of course he was long gone because he got out of space suits and just phased out of existence and reappeared elsewhere in the station. I believe that's what happened, correct?
No, it was just an empty spacesuit inside.
Oh, okay. So the classic red herring cat in the bushes. Not my mistake. Yeah.
You guys eventually, I think Julian managed to kill off like 2 players or something like that before you guys eventually managed to escape in an improvised escape pod. You ended up killing him the only way you could think of killing him, because the guy was basically fucking Jason Voorhees with the ability to teleport and phase through solid matter Kitty Pryde style. But you guys managed to kill him by deorbiting the space station and crashing it into the planet with him on board.
Yes, that was practically the definition of overkill. Or was it? I don't know.
Well, before that, you had shot him full of bullets from a fully automatic cannon, and he lived.
Well, of course, he wasn't exactly in this phase of existence, to be fair, but yeah. So, but that kind of brings up a point. Well, not really, but one of the things, though, is in these role-playing games, oftentimes all the monsters, all the creatures, all the diseases, all the weird powers are listed in this convenient book, which the player can access at any time. So that unfortunately requires the GM be creative in either making new monsters from scratch or portraying the monsters in a way that won't cause one of the players who read all the book, all the rules 10 times over going, oh, okay, that's just the cacodemon guys.
Oftentimes,
just kind of what you did here.
Oftentimes the best monsters are non-player characters who've been monstered up. Like you take a non-player character and you slap the vampire template on it or something. The players know what vampires do, but they don't know what the NPC brings to that half of the equation, and there's the element of the unknown.
Well, yes, but it's still a matter of, okay, how did he do this? Oh, he must have slapped a vampire template on it. So, it almost becomes a game of figuring out what they're dealing with. And if there's a system of rules which are within access to do so, it does become a little less scary. But that's why if you have access to rules like making monsters from scratch, with following certain rules or certain guidelines, I think that can be a lot more effective. I mean, that definitely requires a lot more work on the GM's part, but it makes for better monsters because you start encountering this and go, what the hell? This is impossible. There's no rules for this. Then the GM shrugs and goes, maybe, maybe not. And then they are actually thrown off bounds. But at the same time, if you present a known quantity like the way you did and just are very careful not to let on what it is, it can be pretty terrifying too. So I think the moral of go ahead.
Another good thing is when you're playing in an environment where you have 2 monsters that are very similar in appearance and methodology, but very different in abilities and weaknesses. That way the players can't be sure until the end of the situation which of the 2 monsters they're dealing with. Are they dealing with your classical undead supernatural vampire that lights up when it gets close to sunlight? Or are they dealing with somebody who's basically a were-vampire bat?
Yep. Is it a coral snake or is it a milk snake? You don't know.
Exactly. Yep. And a were-vampire bat would still be active mostly at night because, bat. But they would have different and they would still be a hemophagic, complete with fangs and all that. But they would have different supernatural abilities, and tossing a sunlight spell or a daylight spell or whatever at a werebat wouldn't do dick.
Mm-hmm.
So the players would have to would have to investigate and try and find out which of the two things they're dealing with. Now, the players could easily, it would work very well also, that kind of situation, if before that the players had to deal with a vampire attack. Because then they would bring all of their anti-vampire tactics and whatnot to fighting a situation where it's not a vampire, it's a werebat.
That's a good point. Changing tacks a little bit here. We should also talk about one of the problems which tabletops will have. It's going to be a group. It's harder to get that sense of isolation there. Is it even possible, or even in a game like a tabletop role-playing game?
I would say it is possible, but only by isolating the individual characters in different situations, like pit traps.
Yeah, but the thing is, the players themselves are still like sitting one or 2 feet away from each other. So unless you use certain props like forbidding the player to speak at all, or maybe putting a box over his head, I actually had a GM who did that once. It's kind of limited. And another thing
another way to do it is to get the players to just trust each other. Like, for instance, have traps that don't actually cause damage, but cause like kind of like semi-brainwash conditions. Like one player sets off a trap or gets affected by a spell or whatever that causes them to say always be friendly to a particular NPC. That particular NPC being obviously a bad guy. Well, what you do is you take the player out of the room so the other players can't hear him, and you tell him that he's magically affected to always be friendly to NPC X and not to reveal that fact. And then you take him back into the room. And then later on, you take another player out of the room after he does something, and you just stand outside with him and go talk about him, and just say, you can't share the contents of this conversation with the rest of the room. How you doing? What's your favorite pizza? That kind of thing. Then you bring him back into the room. Now you're left with a situation where the player who's under the suggestion thinks the second player is under a suggestion, whereas the first player who's under a suggestion has no idea what you talked about to the second player. To the second player who's under the suggestion has no idea what you're talking about to the first player under the suggestion. That will create a distrust between the players, because neither one can be sure if the other's actions are truly their actions. And that can be used to isolate players. And then, on top of that, you have the players that you didn't take out of the room who are now noticing that the other players that you did take out of the room are acting strangely.
That can be effective, yeah. It's still tricky because you still took someone out of the room, so at least for a fact that at least one person there's something wrong with them, unless you want to make it a regular thing in a session, which is, I guess that could work as well. What about, there's also, I think there's some value to like dimming the lights a little bit so it's not all bright, and trying to keep, another important thing in horror games like that is to keep the pacing going. Because if it slows down for, like, say, combat, that kind of takes away some of the horror, especially when it's hard to really convey that sense of fast-paced, horrifying, bloody act or deadly action in combat. It's hard to do that with miniatures and rolling dice. So you have, kind of ironically, you have to minimize combat, I think, or keep it moving when you have horror games and tabletop role-playing games.
A good idea when you're doing that kind of thing is to make it so that the only viable option in combat is retreat.
That's one way to do it. So you can't, it's a no-win scenario or impossible to win scenario, unless one of the players gets very clever, but that's kind of the point. If they are very clever, good for them. That's the reward. You get to live.
The classical way of doing that is the stereotypical sniper on a rooftop.
Another good way for a fantasy game for a sci-fi game would be there's you're in a vacuum. What is that called? You're in a airlock, or maybe there's some gas coming out of the ventilation ducts. You have to get out of the room now, but there's also something nasty in the room with you. So there's a whole you have to get the doors open and fend off the creeping alien horror.
Yeah, you're on a timer and you have to succeed, otherwise you get all aliened up.
In that case, time does come a factor. I mean, a round could take literally 20 minutes, but still you only have 5 rounds left. So it makes them think, and it kind of does bring a sense of urgency, even though time is still a little malleable in a role-playing game. That's one good way of doing it. Yeah, definitely.
Like, okay. Like, let's say using Necrawl. You're in a room where you're fighting some Necrawl spiders, and the door out of the room is locked. Well, or got locked behind you. It's an ambush kind of situation. So you're fighting the Necrawl spiders, and you shoot and kill the Necrawl spiders, but you got hit by an EMP going into the door. So all of your electronic weaponry and devices are no longer active, meaning that the support player can no longer use telemetry to just automatically open the door because he has control over electronic control over the doors. You have to actually open it via open locks check. But when you destroy the spiders, the nanite clouds that are in the spiders then eject and slowly start floating towards the nearest electrical impulses, which just happens to be the nervous systems of the players. But the players have no means of denaturing the nanites because the only weapons they have left throw bullets, and nanites don't give a flying fuck about bullets. So the players are in a situation where they literally have this slow creeping doom coming towards them, and the only way out is to wait for the support guy to use his open lock skill, which he's invested like maybe a couple of points into, because hey, it's a science fiction game. How often am I going to have to go classically open a freaking lock when I can just make a cryptography check, point at it in the door, and go open sesame, and it pops open.
How often am I going to use rope skill? Oh, except for that one time when you have to tie a very secure knot when you're doing a spacewalk, and if you fail and the knot comes undone, you're flung to the void of space to drift until your oxygen tank runs out.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You can change the paradigm. Take a science fiction game, and by dint of fact of some well applied technology in an ambush, make it so that all of their sci-fi tech becomes worthless, and they have to go primitive old school against sci-fi monsters. Or if you're playing a fantasy game, you can do something similar by tossing all of your mages and all of your characters that are like relying a lot of their supernatural innate abilities, like paladins and whatnot, and tossing them into an anti-magic field, and now they have to fight, like, say, a horde of ghouls in an anti-magic field, but they can't throw fireballs, lightning bolts, or anything like that, and mages end up just being commoners with a dagger.
Yeah, the anti-magic shtick is a little overkill. There are more creative ways of doing it, but I see where you're coming from there. So we've been talking a lot about Universal Decay Dead Stars. Are there any other game systems or settings you think which do horror pretty well?
Well, Ravenloft does horror. Does horror pretty well. That's mainly because the original Ravenloft took the idea of helplessness and unknown and ran with it. You have literally unkillable boss monsters. No matter how many times you kill a Dark Lord, the motherfucker keeps coming back.
Plus, it toys with your securities. I mean, it changes the rules. It leads that sense of the unknown, the sense of the uncertain that because a lot of the spells and rules change when you go from a campaign world to Ravenloft. There's a classic dark powers check. For those of you who don't know, because this is kind of an older game, Ravenloft was a Dungeons and Dragons campaign setting, which existed in a kind of a demi-plane, kind of a half dimension, which could draw in players from any different worlds. And it was occupied by the Dreadlords, these tormented monsters who are once human and sane, who rule over a domain, and they're basically given a lot of powers, but they're also cursed in some way by their misdeeds. And the players are basically, the whole point of Ravenloft is to get the hell out of Ravenloft because it's full of weird monsters and weird corrupting shits.
But the longer you're in Ravenloft and the more you interact with Ravenloft, the more and all the monsters and shit, the greater the chances that you yourself become corrupted and trapped there as well.
Yeah, so I mean it worked pretty well as far as D&D goes. I mean, it was, for the time, it was one of the best settings for actually playing a horror game. But there are a lot of role-playing games out there now, even some indie ones, which claim to be, all about horror. I mean, I said before, it's kind of hard to run a sustained game where the name of the game is just repeated terror, horror. You're always in a derelict spaceship, always in a haunted mansion. I mean, one example which I saw was being played in Dragon back in Davis was "Don't Rest Your Head." Did you hear about that one, Tyler?
No, I hadn't.
I don't know that much about it. It has to do with the fact that you're playing ordinary people, but suddenly whenever you dream, you get sent to a nightmare world and, you're corrupted, blah, blah, blah. There are a bunch of games like role-playing systems out there. In the same way, there are a lot of indie horror games on the PC right now. So can you think of any other games or settings like that, Tyler, which kind of are intended to be played in horror?
I can't remember the actual name of it. It was something weird like Asylum or Crypt or something like that. But it was a game where the concept of it was that the modern world and all of the world that we exist in is actually a prison for all of the gods and spirits of all of the various mythologies, and everybody alive in the world is unknown to themselves, one of these gods or spirits or whatever of unknown mythologies. And
the name of the game you're thinking of is Cult, Tyler.
That's
spelled Kult. Yeah, Cult. Yeah.
And the players are basically because they've started to go insane in the real world. They've started to realize that the truth of the world. So they're always going in and out of the real world and the actual cult world where everything is like all weird and bizarre and stuff. But
very, very Silent Hill, yeah.
But the jailers in the cult world, whenever somebody escapes and whenever somebody breaches the barrier and enters the cult world, are always trying to hunt you down and throw you back into the real world. Meanwhile, while you're in the cult world and you're doing stuff and interacting with the cult world, yourself in the version of the real world still sees you, but your actions are all weird and different. So you never really know. Like, let's say you're fighting one of the jailers and you manage to finally beat the crap out of him and escape so you can stay in the occult world longer. Eventually, you're going to end up failing and getting tossed into the real world, only to get put on trial for murder.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Cult was also highly philosophical. I think there were elements of Gnosticism or elements of certain Christian sects there. So I mean, there was definitely horror and terror slant to it, but it was also I don't think it was as effective as some other games as far as horror and terror goes, because you could also become superpowered in it, if I'm not mistaken. That was the whole point, that all humans could become freaking gods if they wanted to, or if under the right circumstances. Yeah. So
actually, a game that does that basically fails completely at doing horror, but it still ends up being a good game because what they did was they took horror elements and used it to actually make a good hardcore role-playing game, is the White Wolf series.
Yes.
It was billed as a horror game, but let's face it, there was nothing scary about any of the White Wolf games.
Because you were the monster.
Yeah. The idea of it, where they took the trappings of a horror setting and turned it on its head, was interesting and novel enough and done well enough that the games were still pretty damn fun.
And inspired an entire generation of angsty neo-goths who think they're vampires, and people who think they're werewolves, and people who run around in black capes on parks and on graveyards and other weird shit like that.
Yeah.
Not to mention a lot of the company itself. I mean, the players are so fucking pretentious. It drives me nuts.
But you're
not one of them.
You have to admit, a lot of the renaissance in horror gaming that started back in the 90s or so, where we had if it wasn't for vampire, werewolf, and all of that, we would never have had a Silent Hill, because there would never have been enough of a popularity of the horror genre to make the Silent Hill video game seem to be viable from a financial standpoint.
I'm not sure about Silent Hill. Some other games, maybe, but Silent Hill was actually first of all, made in Japan, so not as great an influence. Secondly, it was actually inspired more by psychological thrillers like Jacob's Ladder was a direct inspiration for Silent Hill. That and a lot of Stephen King novels.
I'm not talking about its inspiration. I'm talking about an executive signing off and saying, yes, we'll pay for this game.
Maybe. I don't know enough about that particular background to talk about that, but yeah, I suppose that's a point. Of course, then you get the classic horror B games, like inspired by Evil Dead or Army of Darkness. It's kind of weird because they're classified as horror games and horror movies, but they're really not. It's almost it's campy basically. It's like a subsection.
That's what I talked about, where you have the trappings of horror are used in a different method than actual horror.
Although, to be fair, Evil Dead, especially some of the first scenes, do actually kind of blur the line between actual scariness and comedy. Like when Ash is walking around the cabin, it's very tense and scary, and when the monster comes out initially, it is actually a pretty freaky. But then he starts doing these Three Stooges fight with it, and it kind of weirds it out.
Yeah,
fear and horror.
You're talking about Evil Dead 2. Evil Dead 1 was nothing but a horror fest from start to finish.
Yeah, but would you say that Evil Dead 2 is a lot more popular, or would you say Evil Dead 1 is?
Evil Dead 1 is a cult classic, but Evil Dead 2 managed to hit the remake, which is basically a remake of Evil Dead 1. Managed to hit that mix of actual horror and campy shtick that really increased its popular appeal.
Yeah, so I think actually that campy shtick, that Evil Dead 2 qualities, I think the closest you can get to actual good horror in a lot of tabletop role-playing games, because sooner or later someone's going to crack a joke about the monster looking like a giant plunger, or sooner or later someone's going to make a farting noise during the game and break it. So I think that's the best way to go with a lot of tabletop role-playing games, is the best you can hope for to a certain extent. There are a lot of techniques which can make it an actually scary experience, despite the fact that there's a limit to how much you can isolate your players, a limit to how much you can scare them since they're not in any real danger, but it can still be done.
Well, also that you can do an inverse horror game, where it's similar to the Vampire Masquerade concept, where the players are the monsters. But unlike what Vampire Masquerade does, where the horror of losing your humanity and all of that, you can horrify the players by having the non-player characters, the actual humans, act like monsters.
What movie which I recently watched am I reminded of? Although to be fair, they weren't actually monsters involved. Chris and Tucker versus Evil, I believe.
Oh, that was so funny. That was so
Yes,
funny.
It was.
Yes. That was like the anti-slasher flick.
Yes, to those of you who have not seen it yet, watch this. It's on Netflix. And why don't you have Netflix by now? Seriously, watch it. Chris and Tucker versus Evil. It's fantastic.
Another good one, Knights of Badassdom.
I knew you'd plug that one, Tyler.
I'm always going to plug that one. It is epic.
Yes. I'm not sure if that's on Netflix, but it's pretty easy to find online.
D&D style live action role players accidentally summon a demon from beyond the bounds of hell during a live action role playing game.
Spoiler alerts! Oh, too late.
And it just goes off the wall.
Yes, and let's leave it at that, because there are some bits in it which are really more effective if you're not expecting them, but definitely worth the viewing.
Particularly given it has Peter Dinklage in it, Summer Glau, and I can't remember his name, but he plays Sookie Stackhouse's brother in True Blood.
Yes, that was good. Okay, we're winding down in our time right now. We have about 9 minutes left, and I thought it might be interesting to finish the podcast by sharing some stories with the listeners as to the times when we were scared the most in real life. Are you up for that, Tyler? Is that a no?
I'm going to have to go with a no, because the time I was scared the most in real life is burned out of my brain. I can't remember it.
I thought that might be the case. Yeah. So I'll just convey a little story that I have, which probably isn't nearly as terrifying for you, but I think it is the time I was one of the scariest times in my life. So it was back when I was still in grade school, and my classmates and I were camping up at Yosemite National Park. And as many of you may know who have been to that park, there's a bear problem there, a very big bear problem. The bears have been there for a while with the people, and they just don't give a shit anymore. They're like honey badgers. They will walk up to campsites and dig through the trash. They'll walk right past you. They are used to people. And so one night, I'm laying in bed in my tent. My dad is fast asleep. I'm still falling asleep. When I start hearing some rustling outside, I ignore it, but it gets louder and louder. And I hear some muttering from outside the camp. And a light is turned on. I quickly learn through listening, through just logic, that there are some bears in the camp, who are apparently going after some of the food in the coolers. I learned later that they had gotten into one of the fishes. But anyways, so I'm sitting there like a quarter of an inch of nylon between me and these things, which have been known to maul people in the past. And I suddenly feel something brushing up against my forehead as I'm lying there. Again, I assume outside the tent. In that moment, I am just fucking scared, ready to run out of the tent, because I think the bear might be walking up along the tent. Do I stand still? Do I move? What do I do? Turns out that I looked aside and see it's my dad, who was stirring in his sleep. So that's a big relief for me. Like, oh God, but it's not over yet. So someone is shining a light at the bear who had gotten up and was watching it. I look up at my tent, and I can see the silhouette of the bear in the tent's fabric through the flashlight. I actually see it moving out there. I didn't sleep a wink after that, and when we got up the next morning, basically the bear had totally trashed one of the coolers. It had got broken through the bear lock, which didn't work that well, and eaten everything there. So, I mean, it's pretty mild as far as scaring goes, but it was just, I was young. I felt the bear was right there. Came out of nowhere. It was pretty fucking terrifying for me at the time.
Well, yeah. Actually, I do have a story that I can share. It was from back when I was doing basic training in the Army. The end of basic training is field exercises, and the last field exercise you do is it's at night. And I don't know if it's like general through all basic training, but what we did was everybody in the training platoon versus the drill instructors.
Ooh.
We all had basically laser tag style setups on our rifles, and the drill instructors were wearing laser tag style vests. And it's late at night, and if a drill instructor grabs you, you're out.
Ooh.
If you manage to hit a drill instructor and set up their vest, it goes scree, 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 kind of, 3 high-pitched squeals that are actually fairly loud and audible, so it's like obvious that the drill instructor has gone down, and the drill instructor is out.
Yes, but it also alerts the other drill instructors as to where you are,
Exactly.
Or gives you an idea close by.
I managed to make it to the very end, and it was just me, one of my squad mates, and one of the guys from another squad who managed to make it to the very end. And we are literally standing on top of a hill in the dead of night, scanning the grass around us towards the bottom of the hill, looking for signs of movement and popping off shots. And each of the little laser tag systems has a set number of shots that it's programmed to put out. So we're, by this point, it's like 3 hours afterwards, we're low on ammo. Everybody else has been picked off and had to go to the waiting area. And I see movement down below, and I'm popping off shots. And I hear squee, 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 and I turn to my left to tell my squad mate, I got him, and my squad mate is gone, and there's a drill instructor there reaching out for me.
Oh, God. That counts as a jump scare, I think, but a pretty effective one.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we have two examples here. Mine was kind of a slow dread horror buildup, and yours was the ultimate jump scare. We have the two.
Oh, believe me, there was a lot of dread horror in that situation. You have to remember that was after 3 hours of seeing the 10 people in my squad get picked off one at a time, but not actually seeing it. It's just you turn to somebody and they just wouldn't be there.
Ooh, boy. Yeah, so That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I mean, it's part of the training, but still, that's got to be disconcerting and probably worse if there's, yeah. Okay, I think that pretty much covers everything, all the topics I had in mind for this month's podcast, and hopefully the audio quality will be much better this time around. We have improved our recording situation here, so
to be exact, we hope we've improved it, but this is the test.
Yeah, so hopefully you'll actually be able to understand 90% of the things that come out of my mouth, the remaining 10% being due to my unfortunately rapid style of speech. So I think that's going to be about it. Any last words, Tyler?
That's about it from my end. Oh, one last thing I want to bring up. Remember, Tristan, the Sanguine lore book.
Ah, yes, vampires. What about it?
That was what I was going to use as the example of the players being the monsters, but the non-player characters, the world around them, being the horrific thing.
Yeah, I think that could probably work as an example. Sanguine Lore, for those of you who don't know, is an expansion for the D20 system, which D&D Pi, which Daemoneye Publishing is working on right now, where you can play vampires or non-vampires in a fantasy setting. It's done pretty effectively.
Yeah, the idea is with it is all the vampire special supernatural abilities are taken out of the package and put into a prestige class that you can qualify for. But you still have all of the weaknesses, and because you have all the weaknesses, it makes the template a +0 level adjustment template. Now, you have a character who's like level 3, violently allergic to sunlight, violently allergic to running water, violently allergic to holy objects, is just like your standard level 3 fighter or whatnot, and is also dependent on, or also has to like consume fresh human blood as part of their diet. And they're in a world where nobody is allowed to escape from the little, the little county-style area that they're actually in, and everybody around them knows vampires exist and the place is infested with them.
Yeah, so it's like Ravenloft Light. Yeah.
So the players who are vampires have to try and survive literally in a world that knows they exist and is hunting them.
Dun, dun, dun. All right. Yep, that's definitely another example of it done right. So, anything else?
I believe that's it.
All right. With that, we might as well sign off. This has been episode 2 of the Daemoneye Podcast. I am Tristan Eifler.
I'm Jay Burrell.
We'll talk to you next time. Happy Halloween.